Mr. Harrison, are you really filing a case against your own son? The judge's voice carried through the packed courtroom. The elderly man standing at the plaintiff's table didn't answer immediately. His wife clutched his arm, eyes red from crying. Yes, Your Honor, he finally said. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Across the courtroom, a man in his late 30s sat beside his wife, arms folded, expression tight with irritation. That's ridiculous, he muttered. The judge glanced down at the file again. You're claiming that your son convinced you to sell your home and business, and then took the money? The old woman's voice trembled. We trusted him. The judge looked up sharply. And where is that money now? The courtroom went completely silent. The father slowly turned and pointed directly at his son. Gasps filled the room. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, this is a very serious accusation. The old man's voice hardened. We gave him everything. If you enjoy powerful courtroom stories like this, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because what this family did to their own parents shocked everyone in that courtroom. And the worst part? The betrayal didn't begin with money. It began with a phone call. The courtroom remained tense as the judge signaled for the proceedings to continue. The elderly couple, Robert and Linda Harrison, sat quietly while their attorney organized a stack of documents on the desk. Across from them sat their son, Daniel Harrison, beside his wife, Melissa. Neither of them looked particularly worried. That alone made the situation feel even colder. Most people in the courtroom had assumed this was a misunderstanding. Families argued about property all the time. But the expressions on the elderly couple's faces told a different story. The judge folded his hands. Mr. Harrison, the court needs to understand how the situation began. Robert nodded slowly. It started about a year ago, Your Honor. The room listened closely. Robert and Linda had lived in Ohio for more than 40 years. Their small manufacturing business had supported them their entire lives. It wasn't a massive company, but it was stable, reliable. The kind of business that allowed them to live comfortably and eventually retire. Their daughter Emily had married and moved to Dubai several years earlier. Their son Daniel lived in another state. For the first time in decades, the couple found themselves alone. That was when the phone call came. It was late in the evening. Robert still remembered the excitement in Daniel's voice. Dad, I've been thinking about something, Daniel had said. Robert smiled at the memory, though it clearly hurt. What's on your mind? You and Mom shouldn't be alone anymore. Linda had been listening on speaker. Daniel continued. You've worked your entire lives. Sell the business, sell the house, move here with us. Linda had been surprised. Are you serious? Of course, Daniel said warmly. We're family. The courtroom listened in silence as the story unfolded. Robert explained how Daniel had insisted that they deserved a peaceful retirement. He promised to help them manage the money, help them settle, help them start a new life. And most importantly, he promised they would never feel alone again. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with it. Because the decision this couple made next changed their lives forever. After months of discussion, Robert and Linda made the biggest decision of their lives. They sold everything, their house, their business, decades of memories packed into moving boxes. Friends were shocked. Neighbors tried to convince them to reconsider. But Robert trusted his son, and Linda believed family always looked out for each other. Within 3 months, the sales were completed. Their accounts were filled with the money they had earned across an entire lifetime. Then they moved. When they arrived at Daniel's house, things seemed normal at first. Daniel greeted them warmly. Melissa smiled politely. For a few days, everything felt like a happy reunion, but something subtle began to change. Daniel became very interested in the money, where it was kept, how it was transferred, how it could be invested. At the time, Robert didn't think much about it. After all, Daniel had suggested the move in the first place, Of course he wanted to help manage things. That's what family did. Or at least, that's what Robert believed. The prosecutor slowly stepped forward. Mr. Harrison, did your son eventually gain access to those funds? Robert looked down, then nodded. Yes. The courtroom became very quiet, because everyone could already sense where this story was heading. But what shocked them most was how quickly everything fell apart. The courtroom remained unusually quiet after Robert Harrison admitted that his son had gained access to their money. Several people in the gallery exchanged looks. At first, the case had sounded like a misunderstanding, but the tension in the room suggested something far more serious. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, he said carefully, tell the court exactly what happened after you moved in, with your son. Robert nodded slowly. Linda held his hand as if giving him strength. At first, Robert said, everything seemed fine. Across the courtroom, Daniel shifted in his chair but said nothing. Robert continued. For the first few days, we felt welcomed. Daniel helped bring in our boxes, showed us the guest room, and said we should rest after the long move. Linda wiped a tear from her cheek. We really believed we had made the right decision. The judge glanced at Daniel and Melissa briefly, then back at Robert. What changed? Robert exhaled slowly. The money. A faint murmur rippled across the courtroom. Robert explained that after the move, Daniel began asking more detailed questions about the funds from the house and business sale, where the money was kept, which bank, how it could be transferred. At the time, Robert assumed Daniel simply wanted to help organize things. Daniel had always presented himself as financially smart. You should move the money into a better account, Daniel had told them one evening at dinner. Why? Linda had asked. Because right now it's just sitting there, Daniel replied. I can help you invest it. The jury members watched closely as Robert spoke. At first I hesitated, Robert said. But Daniel insisted. The defense attorney stood up. Your Honor, advising family about finances is not illegal. The judge nodded slightly. That's true. Continue. Robert continued describing how Daniel offered to help manage the transfers online since Robert and Linda weren't comfortable with modern banking systems. One evening, Daniel placed a laptop on the table. Dad, it's simple, he had said. Just authorize the transfer so I can move the funds into a safer investment account. Linda remembered feeling unsure, but Daniel spoke confidently, and Melissa supported him. He's just trying to help, she had said calmly. Looking back, Linda realized something important. That was the first moment Melissa had involved herself in the money conversation. And after that night, everything slowly changed. If you enjoy courtroom stories like this, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because the next part of this case shocked even the judge. Robert explained how the transfers happened over several days, small amounts first, then larger ones. Daniel always had an explanation. Temporary investment, short-term account, tax advantage. Each time Robert believed him. Until one morning, Robert walked into the kitchen and overheard something that made his stomach drop. Daniel and Melissa were arguing, not quietly. Melissa's voice was sharp. They're going to notice eventually. Daniel sounded irritated. They won't understand the statements. Robert froze in the hallway. At first, he didn't want to believe what he was hearing. But the conversation continued. Melissa said something that later became one of the most important statements in the entire trial. You promised we'd be done with this once the money cleared. Several people in the courtroom gasped when Robert repeated those words. Even the judge's expression hardened. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. Objection, hearsay, the judge raised a hand. Overruled for now. The court will consider the context. Daniel finally spoke from the defense table. That conversation is being twisted, he said quickly, but the prosecutor was already walking forward. Your Honor, she said, we have financial records that confirm what happened. Next, the courtroom screens lit up with bank statements, transfers, withdrawals, large movements of money, all directed into accounts connected to Daniel and Melissa. Linda covered her mouth. Even now, the evidence was painful to see. The judge studied the documents carefully. "Mr. Harrison," he said slowly, "are you saying the money from the sale of your home and business was transferred into your son's accounts?" Robert nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned toward Daniel. "Is that accurate?" Daniel hesitated. Only for a second. But the entire courtroom noticed. "We were managing it for them," Daniel said. The prosecutor immediately responded. "Managing it or taking it?" The tension in the room tightened like a wire. Daniel's confidence began to fade. The prosecutor clicked another file on the screen. Emails, messages, financial planning documents, and then came the twist that made the courtroom erupt. Property listing, the house Robert and Linda had sold, but it wasn't their old house. It was a new property, purchased by Daniel, with their money, and listed under his and Melissa's names. The gallery exploded with whispers. The judge raised his gavel. "Order!" But the shock had already spread. Linda looked at Daniel in disbelief. "You bought a house? With our retirement?" Daniel avoided her eyes. That was the moment the courtroom truly turned against him. The prosecutor spoke again. "And that's not all, Your Honor." She pulled up another document, a message exchange between Daniel and a financial advisor. One sentence stood out clearly on the screen. "Once the money is secured, we'll move them out." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the defense attorney looked stunned. The judge slowly removed his glasses and stared directly at Daniel. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice colder now, "this court would like a very clear explanation." Daniel had no immediate answer, and for the first time since the trial began, he looked genuinely afraid. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Court will recess for 10 minutes. But nobody moved, because everyone in that courtroom had just realized something. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a calculated betrayal, and the worst part of the story had not even been revealed yet. The courtroom slowly filled, again after the short recess, but the atmosphere had completely changed. What had begun as a quiet family dispute now felt like a serious criminal case. Conversations in the gallery had grown louder, and several reporters had quietly taken seats near the back. Daniel Harrison no longer looked confident. He sat stiffly beside his wife Melissa, his fingers locked together on the table while his attorney whispered something urgently to him. Across the room, Robert and Linda Harrison looked exhausted. The truth had taken years to carry, and now every word of it was being unpacked in front of strangers. The judge returned, and the room stood before settling again. "Let's continue," the judge said. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor, the financial records we just reviewed show large transfers into accounts owned by Daniel and Melissa Harrison. But the most disturbing part of this case is what happened after the parents realized the money was gone." Several people leaned forward. The judge looked at Robert. "When did you first realize something was wrong?" Robert cleared his throat. "It was about 2 months after we moved in." He explained that at first, Daniel kept reassuring them that their investments were doing well. Every question had an answer. Every concern was brushed away. But the behavior inside the house began to change. Daniel became distant, cold, and Melissa's attitude shifted even more dramatically. Linda spoke quietly from the witness stand. She started treating us like we were guests who had stayed too long. The courtroom listened carefully. Linda described small things at first. Meals no longer shared together, conversations stopping when they entered a room, doors being closed. But the moment that truly changed everything happened one evening during dinner. Linda remembered it clearly. Robert had asked Daniel a simple question. "Can we see the account statements?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Melissa. Then Melissa spoke. "You don't need to worry about that anymore." The courtroom reacted with soft murmurs. Linda continued. "That was the first time I realized something was wrong." Robert nodded. When I insisted, Daniel got angry. The judge looked up. "Angry how?" Robert hesitated. "He said the money wasn't ours to control anymore." Gasps spread across the room. Daniel immediately leaned toward his lawyer. "That's not what I said," he muttered, but the prosecutor was already stepping forward. "Your Honor, we have a recording from that evening." Now the entire courtroom went still. Daniel's head snapped up. "What recording?" his attorney demanded. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. The plaintiffs began recording conversations after they suspected financial manipulation. The defense objected immediately, but after a brief legal discussion, the judge allowed a portion to be played. The audio filled the courtroom. Robert's voice, calm but firm. "Daniel, we just want to see the money." Then Daniel's voice, irritated. "You gave it to me to manage." Linda's voice followed. "We trusted you." Then Melissa's voice cut through the recording. Sharp. "You two wouldn't even have this money without him helping you move." The courtroom reacted immediately, but the final line made the entire room freeze. Daniel's voice again. "You sold everything because I told you to." Silence. The judge slowly looked toward the defense table. Daniel stared straight ahead. The prosecutor spoke again, and that wasn't the worst of it. Another document appeared on the screen. A notice, a legal eviction consultation. Robert looked down as the courtroom read it. "You were planning to remove them from the house?" the judge asked. Daniel's attorney quickly stood. "Your Honor, that document was never finalized, but the damage had already been done." Linda quietly wiped tears from her eyes. "We had nowhere to go." Several jurors looked visibly disturbed now. One of them even shook their head. The judge turned toward Daniel. "Did you intend to remove your parents from the home after taking their money?" Daniel swallowed. "No," but his voice lacked confidence. The prosecutor continued. "Your Honor, the financial advisor we mentioned earlier is here to testify." A middle-aged man approached the witness stand. He adjusted his tie nervously. "State your name," the clerk said. "Michael Grant." The prosecutor began calmly. "Mr. Grant, did Daniel Harrison consult you about financial planning?" "Yes." "And did he mention where the money came from?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. "He said it was from his parents selling their assets." "And what did he say he planned to do?" Michael looked toward Daniel briefly, then back at the prosecutor. "He said once the transfers cleared, they wouldn't have control over the funds anymore." The courtroom erupted again. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order!" But the tension had reached a breaking point. Daniel leaned forward suddenly. "That's being twisted," he said, but even his own attorney looked uneasy now. Robert stared at his son across the courtroom. There was disbelief in his eyes, but something else too. Sadness. Not anger, just deep disappointment. The judge finally spoke again. "Mr. Harrison, you convinced your parents to sell their home and business, transfer their life savings, and then discussed removing them from the property?" Daniel didn't answer, because the evidence had already answered for him. The judge looked toward the attorneys. "We will move to closing arguments shortly." The entire courtroom understood what that meant. The end of the trial was approaching, and based on everything revealed so far, it wasn't looking good for Daniel Harrison. But there was still one final piece of testimony waiting to be heard, and it was the moment that would completely seal his fate. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Moments earlier, the tension had been building with every piece of testimony, every document passed to the judge, and every word spoken by the elderly couple. Now everyone in the room understood what this case truly was. Not just a financial dispute, but a story of betrayal that had shocked the entire court. Judge Margaret Holloway slowly adjusted the papers in front of her. Her expression was firm, but there was also something else in her eyes. Disappointment. Because this case was not about strangers. It was about a son. And the two people who had trusted him more than anyone else in the world. Across the courtroom, Richard and Eleanor. Hayes sat quietly. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he held his wife's hand. Months earlier, they had walked into their son's home, believing they were beginning a new chapter of their lives. Now they were sitting in court, fighting to recover everything they had ever worked for. On the opposite side sat Daniel Hayes and his wife, Rebecca. Daniel avoided looking at his parents. Rebecca stared forward with an irritated expression, as if this entire trial had been an inconvenience to her life. But the judge was not finished reviewing the evidence, and what she was about to say would decide everything. Earlier that morning, the prosecution had presented financial records that painted a devastating picture. When Richard sold his home and business, the money, nearly $1.8 million, had been transferred into a joint account that Daniel controlled. The promise had been simple. Daniel told his parents the money would be used to buy a larger home where they could all live together, comfortably. Instead, within weeks, the money began disappearing. Luxury car purchases, expensive vacations, designer shopping sprees, large transfers into Rebecca's personal accounts. Even worse, records showed that Daniel had quietly transferred the remaining funds into an investment account under only his and Rebecca's names. His parents were never listed as owners. When the prosecutor finished explaining the transactions, murmurs spread across the courtroom. People could hardly believe what they were hearing, a son using his parents' entire life savings as if it were his personal lottery win. Judge Holloway tapped her pen against the desk. "Mr. Hayes," she said calmly, looking directly at Daniel. "Did your parents authorize these transfers?" Daniel shifted in his seat. "They were living with us. Everything we did was for the family." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "For the family?" she repeated. She lifted one document from the stack. "This is a receipt for a $92,000 sports car, another paper, a luxury resort in the Bahamas. Then another, $30,000 transferred to your wife's private account labeled personal spending." Daniel swallowed but said nothing. Across the courtroom, Eleanor lowered her head. The woman who had once defended her son to everyone who doubted him could barely look in his direction anymore. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecutor played a recorded phone call. It had been captured by Richard months earlier when he began to realize something was wrong. The courtroom speakers crackled. Daniel's voice filled the room. "You already gave me the money, Dad. It's my responsibility now. You should just relax." Then Richard's voice. "That money was for our future too, son." There was a pause, and then Daniel's response that made several people in the courtroom visibly react. "You're living in my house now. Don't start acting ungrateful." The recording ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything said during the trial. Judge Holloway slowly removed her glasses. She looked toward the elderly couple, then back at Daniel. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "your parents trusted you with the total value of their life's work." Daniel stared at the desk, and according to the financial evidence presented, the judge continued, that trust was exploited. Rebecca leaned toward her attorney, whispering nervously. For the first time since the trial began, the confidence she had shown was gone, because the judge was now preparing to make her ruling. Judge Holloway folded her hands together. "This court does not take family disputes lightly," she said. "But what happened here goes far beyond a disagreement between relatives." She turned slightly toward the courtroom gallery. People leaned forward in their seats. Everyone wanted to hear what would happen next. Then the judge spoke the words that would change the Hayes family forever. Daniel Hayes and Rebecca Hayes knowingly misappropriated funds that belonged to Richard and Eleanor Hayes under false pretenses. Rebecca's face turned pale. Daniel finally looked up. The judge continued. "The court finds sufficient evidence of financial exploitation of elderly individuals, fraud, and unlawful transfer of assets." Gasps spread through the courtroom. Richard squeezed Eleanor's hand tighter. But the judge was not finished. "The court orders that all remaining assets purchased using these funds be liquidated immediately." She paused before continuing. "And the full amount is to be returned to Richard and Eleanor Hayes." Eleanor covered her mouth in disbelief. Tears began rolling down her face. For months, she had feared everything was gone forever. But the most shocking part of the ruling was still coming. Judge Holloway's voice became even firmer. "Furthermore, Due to the severity of the financial abuse and the clear intent demonstrated by the defendants, Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. "Your Honor," but the judge raised her hand. "Sit down, counsel." The courtroom was completely still. Daniel Hayes and Rebecca Hayes are hereby sentenced to federal custody pending formal sentencing for financial exploitation, fraud, and elder abuse. Rebecca's chair scraped loudly as she stood up. "What? That's insane." "Order!" the bailiff shouted. Daniel's face had gone completely pale. Two officers stepped forward. In the gallery, several people whispered in shock. A son being taken away in handcuffs because he stole from his own parents. Richard watched silently as officers placed handcuffs on Daniel. For a brief moment, father and son locked eyes. Daniel looked like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Rebecca began arguing loudly with the officers as she too was placed in custody. The judge watched the scene without emotion, because in her courtroom, the law did not change simply because someone shared the same last name. As the couple was escorted out, Eleanor broke down into tears. Not tears of anger, not even tears of relief. They were the painful tears of a mother realizing that justice had come at the cost of losing her own child. Richard gently wrapped his arm around her shoulders and quietly said the only thing he could. "At least, we told the truth." Judge Holloway gave one final look toward the elderly couple before standing. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and the case that had shocked everyone in that courtroom was finally over. But the story of what happened inside that family would stay with everyone who witnessed it for a long time.